Hi there, my name is Andrea DeLarco. I am a student therapist at the Village of Hoffman Estates Department of Health and Human Services. This month of April is Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, and in honor of this, the following video was created for parents to come up with ways to talk about sex, body safety, and consent with their children. I hope you find it helpful and informative, and sit back, relax, and enjoy. Talking about sex can be a difficult and awkward conversation for both parents and children, but the good news is it doesn't have to be. We see the various presentations of sex in our world on television, on social media, literally everywhere. And yet, while this is so in our face, it's still so difficult to talk about at home. Why is that? In order to better understand this question, it could be helpful to think about the messages that you were sent about sex, especially during your childhood. So consider, when did you learn about sex? How did you learn about sex? And as a parent, have you talked to your children about sex? If so, what did this look like? What have you told your children? And if you haven't talked to your children about this, what are some of the concerns and reservations you have surrounding having this conversation? And I can imagine right now you're wondering, how in the world am I just going to bring this up to my child? What is that even going to look like? And to kind of help better prepare you for that, we're going to talk about some age-appropriate ways to talk about sex with your child. So, think about it this way. It's really all about the details. For young children, such as toddlers and preschoolers, they're typically satisfied with more vague answers to their questions. So while you may not discuss the act of sex with your young child, you could help shape their understanding of it by helping them identify their own body parts. And when doing this, be sure to use the actual names of their parts rather than coming up with nicknames for them. So for example, try referring to reproductive organs as a vagina or a penis, rather than saying private parts. And I know that sounds probably a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm sure many of you probably cringed even hearing me say that. But I can assure you that over time it'll become more fluid and more natural. And another age-old question is, where do babies come from? And you could simply say to them, out of their mommy's stomach or vagina. And typically, that will give them the kind of response that they're looking for to have their question answered. For school-age children, they might ask more specific questions. And currently, kids can get an answer literally through a quick Google search or a friend. And although it's not always the right one, it's often the most easily accessible answer for them. So because of this, it's important to ensure that your child has accurate information. And a good way to gauge their knowledge is just to simply ask them what they already know and what they think they know about sex. And be sure to clarify any misconceptions and be as thorough as possible. As we think about the do's, let's think about a couple don'ts to consider. So one of this is making fun of your child for how they ask their questions and the questions that they ask. You know, it could be a very vulnerable thing for them, a child, to come up and ask you these questions. So important not to do that. And another don't involves not using nicknames and metaphors for explaining sex and referring to parts of the body, as we just touched on before. So both of these are big don'ts because they might make your child feel insecure about their questions or that their questions are unacceptable. And that's something that we don't want. We really want to open up that dialogue for talking about sex and making them feel comfortable doing so. So consider the following examples. And these may not come up directly as a question from your child. It might come up in conversation, or you might bring them up. However they come up, I'm going to give you some ideas for how to answer them and provide the proper information to your child at a school age. So what's a period? You can explain how menstruation is an important part of the female reproductive cycle and is a normal part of going through puberty. So you might offer a description of menstrual bleeding and hygiene products that are used during this part of a reproductive cycle in individuals who have female reproductive organs. And you might say, in females, a period means that the body is mature enough to become pregnant. So this is a helpful way to kind of get into the conversation about sex, because you can talk about the importance of the period in the reproductive process and what that looks like. Another question that might be helpful is, what's an erection? You might say, a penis is usually soft, but sometimes it gets hard and stands up. And this is called an erection. And you can describe when an erection might happen. So this can happen during sleep, or when the penis is touched, or when the individual is, excited by something in their environment or that they've come into contact with. So it might look different for other people, but it's important to explain what that might look like for somebody. Another question involves masturbation. What is it? So you could say something like, masturbation is when you rub yourself in the genital area. Now, a lot of times with masturbation in young children, they're developmentally, it's appropriate for them to be touching themselves. They're experimenting with their bodies. They're trying to make sense of what is going on with my body right now. It could be a very healthy thing for them to do. So it's important to remind your child that this is a very normal process. It could be normal, it could be pleasurable, but also reminding them that while this is a normal experience, it is a private activity that they do. And then if you really want to go for it and get right into sex, you can talk about how do people have sex? So your child might wonder about the specifics, like how exactly does sex work? And you could be honest. So for sex between a man and a woman, you could say a penis goes inside a vagina. And this is a great opportunity to have the conversation around sexual identity, gender identity, and helping your child understand how sex can look between a girl and a girl and a boy in terms of how they might understand it. And you could say they can have sex with each other and they can also love each other. So you might discuss those things separately, but they can occur together too. So again, a great opportunity to start that conversation with your young children. And something with that too is that having the conversation around identity can teach your child to be more aware and respectful of others, and expressing your own love for your child and expressing that unconditional love for them and having that awareness yourself. So at the end of this video, I'm actually going to provide you with a series of resources with some books and other information for you to utilize in having this conversation. And a lot of the books that I'm providing will have visuals, and they'll have age-appropriate visuals that make sense to the child at whatever particular age that they're at. These are a really great way to get them to have a better understanding of what sex might look like, if you don't necessarily feel like you can articulate it in a way that a picture might for them. You can guide them with your dialogue on top of having the pictures there too. And with teenagers, it's especially important to be direct with them and to clarify any inaccurate information. The teenage years are a time that's often filled with curiosity, experimenting, and also peer pressure. So it's important that you have the answers to their questions and that they can openly explore these curiosities with you. And you can provide more elaborate explanations to questions such as those that we just discussed. Another way of talking about this is to talk about your teen's social life. So what are their friends doing? Are any of their friends dating? Are they dating? Is your child dating? Romantic relationships could be a great platform for inserting the conversation of sex. So perhaps you can ask if the discussion of sex has come up in conversation with their friends, or if they are in a romantic relationship, you can ask them if they have talked about having sex with their partner and to see if they're sexually active. And it's important to present this question and kind of explore this as more of a curious question, as we call it, rather than presenting it as a criticism or a concern. So really showing that genuine interest and care about them and their well-being. Because it's important. We don't want our child to feel like they'll get in trouble if they share that they're having sex, or to feel shameful for having this sexual experience. And if they are sexually active, discuss safe sex and responsibilities associated with being sexually active, and offer them the space to ask questions about sex.
I just think it's really important so people know not only how to be safe, like from things like pregnancy and STDs, but also sort of how to feel empowered to like ask for what they want within sexual relationships and just have good relationships.
And this would be a great opportunity to introduce to them the various types of contraceptives surrounding sex, and to remind them that not all contraceptives are the same. So real briefly, like going over them, thinking about like barrier methods such as condoms and hormonal contraceptives such as the pill or an injection, or more long-lasting but reversible contraception such as an intrauterine device such as an IUD. And there's emergency contraception, and it's important to talk about the usage of that and how that's not something that should be used in lieu of a primary form of contraception, such as condoms or a birth control pill. And then there's also permanent contraception, which you could talk about in terms of like a medical procedure. So individuals with female reproductive organs might get a tubal ligation, and a individual who has male reproductive organs might get a vasectomy. And then finally, discussing abstinence as a form of birth control. So your child might be thinking about it, and maybe they're not at the point where they're ready to have sex. And it's important that they know that abstinence is a form of birth control and it is a choice, really giving them that power and autonomy to make that decision, whatever it is. And additionally, when talking about sex and contraceptives, you can touch upon sexually transmitted infections and what could turn into a sexually transmitted disease. So reminding them if they're choosing to have sex, their risk by nature of contracting an STI increases rather than if they were abstaining from sex. And just explaining how different types of birth control don't necessarily prevent against sexually transmitted infections, such as the hormonal birth control or an IUD. They may not work similarly to a condom that's designed to prevent against pregnancy and sexually transmitted infection. And also reminding your child that even when they use protection, such as a condom, if it's used inappropriately, it may not be as effective. So keeping that in mind too. And finally, on that topic, reminding your child that STIs can be transmitted through oral sex too. Now, that all being said, regardless of your child's age, it's really important to reiterate to your child that they will likely receive many, often conflicting messages surrounding sex. And this might occur throughout the early part of their life, and that's okay. But it's important that with that, they have all the facts about sex and that they're able to formulate their own opinions and feelings surrounding sex. And be sure to let your child know that everyone has different views surrounding sex. So what they choose to do may not look like what another person in their peer group does, and that's okay. You really want to develop that independence so that they can feel comfortable making their own decisions. And it's crucial that your child knows that they can make their own decisions surrounding sex and that others don't have to influence this or should influence the decisions that they make. It's also important for your child to feel like they have the space to learn about their bodies and sex and have their questions answered to make sense of this process as they explore. So this kind of is a roundabout way of talking about everything we just discussed, is really paving the way and having that conversation with them. So now that we know what to talk about, why don't we go into the how we talk about it? So to help you better prepare yourself for this conversation, it could be helpful to reflect upon your reactions to this information. So as I was talking about this, were you uncomfortable? Did you find it funny? Did you feel like it was hard to take seriously? Regardless of what the reaction was, that's okay. But it's important to think about why you had those reactions and consider how the influences and messages that you received surrounding sex, which you may have reflected upon when prompted earlier in this video, might influence these reactions. Something that might help you combat the discomfort associated with discussing sex is remembering that the discussion of sex doesn't have to be and really shouldn't be a one and done conversation. And hopefully that takes some of the pressure off of both you and your child in knowing that this conversation is ongoing. And a lot of times in movies and TV shows, there's a big sit down where the parent awkwardly brings up this conversation of sex where it's just completely random and not really well orchestrated at all. But it doesn't have to be like that, because half the time that's even more awkward for both people involved, and we want to eliminate the amount of discomfort that goes into this conversation. And having really brief and natural conversations about this over time can be really helpful to alleviate that discomfort. In fact, sex education is typically more effective and bearable for parents and children if it's integrated into natural everyday experiences. So feel free to find those opportunities wherever they come up. Just go with your gut. If it feels like the right time, that's the right time. Talk about it. Don't be shy. So for example, if there's a pregnancy in the family, this might be a good time to talk about how the baby develops in the womb, especially for our little ones, understanding how that process works. And if you're watching a television show, and I know really most people have the capability to flip through right through the commercials these days, but if you're watching commercials too, if there's a tampon commercial, for example, this might be a good time to talk about periods. And finally, kind of like what we talked about before, just take an interest in your child's life, and more specifically their social life. Try asking them about their friendships and romantic relationships and dating as a segue to having the conversation of sex. Remember, we want to do curious questioning, so something to keep in mind as you prepare for the conversation. Another important area to address when discussing sex with your child is consent. And while I am presenting this as a separate section within this video from sex, please note that the discussion of consent can always be integrated into the conversation surrounding sex. And, it's similar to sex in terms of that it's something that should be taught early on in childhood, and something that can be a continuous conversation over time as your child gets older. And again, you can use age-appropriate ways of discussing this. So for young children, you can discuss it in terms of body safety. So this might look like teaching your young child to ask before hugging or touching a friend or somebody else that they encounter, or telling them that they don't have to hug or kiss a relative just because they're a relative. Reminding them that they don't have to hug or kiss anybody if it doesn't feel right for them. And talking about touching people and how no matter who it is, nobody should be touching their genitalia. And thinking about how when young children are babies, how their parent might have to change their diaper, explaining why that has to happen so that they understand that it's okay if my mom or dad or a loved one is changing my diaper because I need to be clean, versus somebody who's violating them and touching them in ways that they don't want to be touched. And this kind of goes back to the conversation of teaching your child the direct names of their body parts, not using nicknames. So this way that they can communicate any experiences that they have that might involve their body is very important. You can set some boundaries with your young child. So letting them know that they could say no or stop when you're playing with them or something doesn't feel right to them. So you can even come up with an agreed upon safe word to use when someone wants to stop playing. So this could be used by both you as the parent and the child. And you can also teach your children to get comfortable asking for play to stop and respecting when others want to stop. Really getting the early stages of understanding what consent is and how it works. And for young children, another way you could talk about it is the gut feeling. You know, that good old feeling that you get in your stomach when something doesn't feel right. You know it feels familiar. The feeling feels familiar, but what's going on may not. So it often comes on quickly and intensely. So you can teach your child about the importance of listening to the gut feeling and trusting it as a signal for discomfort. Though it's important that they know they shouldn't rely on the gut feeling alone as an indicator for when something is unsafe or something wrong is happening. A couple of points of emphasis for your child related to this is that they understand that this signal might happen around people we know too, not just strangers. So a lot of times there's this myth that trusted others cannot perpetrate us or put us in a situation where we feel uncomfortable or disrespect our trust. And it's really important that the child knows that there are no exceptions to who needs to ask for their consent. So something really, as a child is starting to develop, that you want them to understand. For teens, consider asking them the following questions when having conversations around consent. So consider, can a person who's intoxicated by alcohol or drugs consent to sex? Do you have to consent to sex after the first time you have sex with somebody? Do power differentials affect your ability to give consent? And what does safe sex have to do with consent? So these are questions that you can think about in terms of how you want to approach talking to your child and see how they respond to the conversation. And this can really open up a good dialogue surrounding the misconceptions and what seems to be the misunderstandings about consent. And you might also discuss empathy with your teen. And this is at the core of understanding consent, truly. And like many things, modeling that empathy as a parent is something that's important to do. Because even when you think your teen is not listening to you and doesn't care about what you do, they're always watching to see how you handle situations at any given time. And this might be related to the topic of consent. And another way to exercise this empathy is to discuss how they might have handled moral issues with friends. Or if a situation came up at school, you could help them kind of navigate through how they would problem solve that and how that relates to empathy. And remind your child that consent is not a gray area.
How many of you like French fries? Oh yeah, okay. Put your hands up high. Fries lovers?
Okay, she says, what if you sit down at a lunch table with your French fries and friends just start grabbing them?
How many of you are actually okay with that?
Even if I don't want all the fries, it's just the principle of the fact that they think they can take my fries when I bought them with my money.
I mean, in general, like the people who respect you enough to ask are the people that you want to share with.
Now, how does this actually relate to sexuality? Not to minimize the topic of consent with fries, but like what belongs to you? Your body. People's bodies belong to them. They get to choose how they touch and get touched because their bodies belong to them.
This seems to be a big misconception surrounding sex. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of really horrible and uncomfortable experiences happen, is when people are operating in the gray area of consent. Simply put, only a verbal yes indicates a person's consent. And also discuss with your child how the influence of drugs and alcohol can cause impairment in a person's ability to give their consent. And similarly, avoid victim blaming and shaming. So kind of related to the modeling as a parent. A lot of times there's been a lot of incidences in the media or situations that might come up with your child's friends where people might be blaming the victim or making the person feel shameful. And it's really important to give the message about consent that, people whose consent was not utilized and exercised, that was not their fault. That's not something that they chose to have happen to themselves.
So you have every right then in that moment to say, you know what, this doesn't feel so right. I want to stop. And that no one should ever have to engage in a sexual experience that they don't feel comfortable in or that they're coerced into, that we have the right to change our minds.
And this kind of goes along with reporting. So if someone is violating your child's safety or somebody who your child really cares about is being violated by somebody or touches them in areas that they don't want to be touched, it is crucial that they know that they are not responsible for what somebody else did to them, no matter who it is, no matter what the relationship is, but that they should still tell an adult or a trusted other when this occurs so that they can get help.
There is a need for there to be conversation and education around all the different ways in which our culture influences our relationships and social dynamics that may lead to harassment or assault.
Now, I know I just threw a lot of information at you, and rest assured that there's no such thing as the perfect parent who has all the answers to every single one of the questions that their child asks. And as we come to the end of our program, I wanted to remind you that talking to your child about sex does not mean that you're encouraging them to have sex. And similarly, not talking about sex does not guarantee that your child will abstain from sex. When you talk to your child about sex and consent, you're teaching them how to make safe and informed decisions surrounding sex and their bodies, and demonstrating to them that you care about their safety and well-being. I wanted to thank you so much for tuning into this presentation. I hope you found the information helpful and that you feel more prepared to having these conversations with your child. And I hope that having these conversations make you feel more connected to your child. On the slides following this video, there will be information regarding how to report a sexual assault, as well as additional resources for discussing sex and consent with your child.